The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the top-floor office as Lin Wang packed her small carry-on bag. Unlike most airline company owners who traveled with assistants and luxury luggage, Lin preferred her well-worn backpack that had accompanied her on countless journeys. At 52, she had the kind of face that looked thoughtful rather than severe, with laugh lines that hinted at a life filled with as much joy as hard work. 23 years ago, Lin had started Skybridge Airlines with just 2 small planes and a dream. Now the company operated over 120 aircraft and flew to 78 destinations worldwide. Despite her success, Lin remained one of the most down-to-earth people in the industry. Her employees who knew her personally often joked that you'd never guess she was worth millions if you bumped into her at the grocery store. Lin zipped up her bag and glanced at the clock on the wall. She had a flight to catch in 3 hours, one of her own company's flights, of course. Lin had made it a personal tradition to fly on her airline at least once a month, always booking her ticket through the regular channels and often traveling under her married name, which few people connected to the airline. It was her way of experiencing the service exactly as her customers did. "Are you sure you don't want me to call for a car service?" asked May, her assistant of 15 years, standing at the office door with a concerned expression. Lin shook her head and smiled. "The subway works just fine. Besides, the traffic is terrible this time of day." May sighed, used to her boss's simple ways but still finding them remarkable. "At least let me book you a first-class ticket properly through our system. This whole secret shopper thing you do is exactly how I know what we need to improve." Lin finished for her with a warm smile. "Don't worry. I already booked my ticket online like any other passenger would." Lin had chosen to wear comfortable clothes for the 5-hour flight, a pair of well-loved jeans, a simple blue sweater, and walking shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was the founder and owner of one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. After saying goodbye to May and the few remaining staff members working late, Lin took the elevator down to the ground floor. The headquarters of Skybridge Airlines occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming downtown building. But Lin often thought the real heart of the company was at the airports and on the planes themselves, not in these corporate offices. The subway ride to the airport was crowded as usual. Lin stood holding onto a pole, just another commuter heading home at the end of the day. A young man offered her his seat, which she declined with a smile. These small human interactions always reminded her why she'd started the airline: to connect people, to make travel more accessible and less stressful. Lin had grown up in a small town, the daughter of a mechanic and a nurse. Her parents had saved for years to afford occasional family trips, and those rare journeys had sparked Lin's love of travel. But they'd also shown her how intimidating and sometimes unwelcoming the travel industry could be for ordinary people. When she founded Skybridge, Lin had vowed to create an airline where everyone felt valued, regardless of whether they flew economy or first class. The past week had been particularly exhausting. Lin had been in back-to-back meetings with potential investors for a new expansion project. Skybridge was planning to add several new international routes, and while the company was financially sound, the expansion required additional capital. The meetings had gone well, but the constant need to be on, to project confidence and authority, always drained Lin more than regular work. These incognito trips on her own airline were more than just quality control. They were a chance for Lin to step back from being the boss and remind herself what Skybridge was really about. Today's flight would take her to the West Coast, where she would be meeting with airport authorities about a new terminal dedicated to Skybridge operations. The company's growth continued to amaze even Lin herself sometimes. As she entered the airport, Lin felt the familiar buzz of energy that always filled these spaces. The mixture of excitement, stress, reunions, and departures that made airports such emotionally charged places. She loved watching people in airports almost as much as she enjoyed flying itself. There were business people rushing to make connections, families embarking on vacations, couples separating or reuniting with tearful hugs. Lin joined the line at the self-check-in kiosks, patiently waiting her turn behind a family with young children who were having trouble with the touchscreen. She could have gone straight to the first-class counter, but that wasn't how this exercise worked. The whole point was to experience the airline as her customers did, to feel the pain points and identify opportunities for improvement. When it was finally her turn at the kiosk, Lynn quickly checked in for her flight to San Francisco. She had splurged on a first-class ticket, not because she cared about the extra legroom or free drinks, but because she wanted to evaluate the premium service her airline offered. The screen displayed her seat assignment: 2A, a window seat near the front of the first-class cabin. Boarding pass in hand, Lynn made her way to security. The lines were long, as they always were during the evening rush. Lynn spotted one of her employees, a woman named Rita who worked as a customer service supervisor. Rita didn't notice Lynn, which was perfect. Lynn watched as Rita efficiently helped an elderly gentleman who was confused about the security procedures, showing him exactly where to place his items and explaining the process with patience and kindness. Lynn made a mental note to send a commendation to Rita's department head. After clearing security, Lynn still had over an hour before her flight. She wandered through the terminal, stopping to browse in a bookshop and picking up a new mystery novel for the flight. She also bought a bottle of water and a small package of almonds from a convenience store, unwilling to pay the inflated prices for snacks on board, despite knowing that in first class they would be complimentary. As Lynn approached the gate area, she noticed that the flight seemed quite full. Passengers were already clustering around the boarding lanes, even though boarding wouldn't begin for another 20 minutes. Lynn found a seat somewhat away from the crowd and opened her novel, but her attention kept drifting to the gate agents and how they were interacting with passengers. One agent in particular caught her eye, a young woman who looked new to the job, judging by how often she glanced at her more experienced colleague for guidance. Despite her apparent nervousness, the young agent maintained a friendly demeanor with each passenger who approached with questions. Lynn's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from her operations director, letting her know that there had been a minor issue with one of the fleet's planes earlier that day. Nothing serious, just a delayed departure due to a catering mix-up. The director assured Lynn that everything had been resolved smoothly and passengers had been compensated, with vouchers for future flights. This was exactly the kind of operational detail Lynn didn't want to be bothered with when she was in passenger mode. She had a capable, executive team who could handle day-to-day issues. Lynn silenced her phone and tucked it into her pocket, returning her attention to the gate area. The boarding process began with pre-boarding for passengers needing extra assistance. Lynn watched as an older couple was helped onto the jet bridge by one of the gate agents. Then came the announcement for first-class passengers to board. Lynn gathered her backpack and novel and joined the short line forming at the priority boarding lane. As she approached the gate, Lynn handed her boarding pass to the young agent she'd noticed earlier. The woman scanned the pass and looked up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly as she looked at Lynn, then back at the boarding pass. Lynn could almost see the thoughts running through the young woman's mind, the mental calculation happening as she took in Lynn's casual appearance and compared it to the first-class ticket in her hand. It was a reaction Lynn had seen many times before. That moment of surprise when someone who didn't look the part turned out to be traveling in premium class. To the agent's credit, she recovered quickly, her professional smile returning as she wished Lynn a pleasant flight. Lynn thanked her and continued on to the jet bridge, unaware that in just a few minutes, her routine quality control trip would turn into something quite different when she reached the actual check-in counter. Lynn walked down the jet bridge, mentally noting how clean it was and that the carpet could use replacing in some spots, another detail to add to her ever-growing list of improvements. But as she approached the aircraft door, a flight attendant stepped forward with an apologetic look on his face. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there seems to be an issue with your boarding pass. Could you please return to the check-in counter? They need to verify something." Lynn raised her eyebrows in surprise. This was unusual. She'd already passed through security in the gate. Her ticket had been scanned without any technical issues. Still, she nodded politely and turned around. "Of course," she said, hiding her curiosity. This unexpected development would give her even more insight into how her airline handled irregular situations. Diane's eyes widened. "But that's—" She stopped herself. "Let me fix this immediately." "Actually," Lynn said, gently touching Diane's arm to stop her, "I'd prefer if you didn't make a scene just yet. This is exactly the kind of situation I'm trying to observe when I do these trips." Diane looked uncomfortable but nodded slowly. "I understand, but—" She hesitated. "Captain Chen is flying today. He'll want to come say hello once he knows you're aboard, and the other senior crew members will recognize you as well. Lynn considered this. Her experiment in anonymity was clearly coming to an end, but perhaps that was for the best. The real test of her company's culture wasn't just in how they treated an unknown passenger, but in how they handled mistakes once they were discovered. That's fine, Lynn said finally, but let's keep things low-key for now. I'm curious to see how this plays out. Diane nodded, though she still looked troubled. As you wish. But I want you to know that whatever happened at check-in is not how we train our staff to behave. I know, Lynn assured her. That's why I do these trips, to find the gaps between our training and the reality. As Diane returned to the gate desk, Lynn noticed her having an intense but hushed conversation with the other gate attendants. One of them glanced over at Lynn with an expression of dawning horror. Word was starting to spread. Within minutes, a tall man in a pilot's uniform appeared at the gate area, scanning the waiting passengers. Captain Chen had apparently been informed of Lynn's presence. When he spotted her, he walked directly over, his bearing formal but his eyes warm with respect. "Ms. Wang," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's an honor to have you aboard today. I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." Several heads turned. A few regular flyers on Skybridge Airlines recognized the name, and whispers began to circulate among the waiting passengers. "Thank you, Captain Chen," Lynn replied with a smile. "I'm looking forward to experiencing our service today." The captain's eyes dropped to the economy boarding pass in Lynn's hand, and his expression shifted subtly. "I see you're in 23B today," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "Is there a reason you're not in first class? We would be honored to have you there." Before Lynn could respond, a flustered-looking gate agent, not one of those who had been talking with Diane, hurried over. "Ms. Wang Chen," she said, slightly out of breath, "there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Your first-class seat is available, of course. I've reprinted your correct boarding pass." She held out a new boarding pass showing seat 2A in first class. Lynn accepted it with a gracious nod. "Thank you. Though I'm curious. Was the first-class cabin actually overbooked, as I was told earlier?" The agent's face flushed. "No, ma'am. There was no overbooking situation. I'm not sure why you were given that information." By now, a small crowd of airline staff had gathered nearby, watching the interaction with various expressions of concern and curiosity. Lynn spotted Patricia standing at the edge of the group, her face pale as she realized what was happening. Tyler was nowhere to be seen. "I see," Lynn said. She turned back to Captain Chen. "It seems there was some confusion about my ticket." The captain's expression darkened slightly. "I'll make sure this is addressed, Ms. Wang. Please allow me to personally escort you onto the aircraft when boarding begins." Lynn could have refused, could have insisted on boarding with everyone else. But she understood the importance of face-saving gestures in situations like this. The staff needed to feel they had done something to correct the error. "That would be lovely. Thank you." As the captain returned to his pre-flight duties, Lynn noticed the atmosphere at the gate had changed dramatically. Staff members were moving with heightened alertness, throwing frequent glances her way. Several passengers who had overheard the exchange were looking at her with newfound interest, trying to figure out exactly who she was that warranted such special attention. An older gentleman sitting nearby leaned toward Lynn. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Are you the Lynn Wang who started this airline?" Lynn smiled. "Yes, I am," the man chuckled. "I thought so. I've been flying Skybridge since the early days. Used to be just a few routes, if I recall correctly." "4 routes when we started," Lynn confirmed. "With just 2 planes. And now look at you," the man said with genuine admiration. "One of the biggest success stories in the industry. Though it seems not everyone recognizes the boss when they see her." He nodded discreetly toward the gate staff who were still in apparent damage control mode. "It's actually by design," Lynn confided. "I prefer to experience our service as any other passenger would." The man nodded appreciatively. "Smart business. Though I imagine someone's in hot water now." Before Lynn could respond, a distinguished-looking woman in a Skybridge executive uniform hurried into the gate area. Lynn recognized her immediately. Vivian, the airport's Skybridge terminal manager. Someone had called in the big guns. Vivian spotted Lynn and made a beeline for her, her expression a careful mask of professional concern. "Ms. Wang," Vivian said, slightly breathless. "I just heard what happened. Please accept my deepest apologies for this unfortunate incident. Lynn stood to greet her. Hello, Vivian. There's no need for apologies. These things happen. No, they absolutely should not happen, Vivian insisted. Especially not to you. I've already begun looking into the situation, and I assure you there will be consequences for the staff involved. Lynn's expression turned serious. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I don't want anyone fired over this. Vivian looked surprised. But the level of disrespect wasn't personal, Lynn finished for her. They had no idea who I was, and that's exactly the point. I'm more concerned about why they felt it was appropriate to treat any passenger that way, not just me. Vivian nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. I see. You're right, of course. This reflects a deeper issue with our service culture. Exactly, Lynn said. And that's what we need to address. Where's Tyler now? I'd like to speak with him. Vivian looked uncomfortable. He's been temporarily removed from customer-facing duties while we address the situation. Patricia is writing up an incident report. Lynn checked her watch. We have about 20 minutes before boarding. Would you mind bringing them both to the lounge? I think we should talk before the flight. As Vivian hurried off to arrange the meeting, the older gentleman who had been speaking with Lynn earlier gave her an approving nod. Now that's leadership, he said. Most bosses would have fired them on the spot. Lynn shook her head. Firing people doesn't solve cultural problems. And we clearly have one if our staff are making judgments about who deserves to be in first class based on how they're dressed. By now, the story of what had happened was spreading throughout the gate area. Passengers were watching with interest as various airline officials came and went, all seemingly centered around the unassuming woman in jeans and a sweater, who turned out to be the airline's founder and CEO. A few minutes later, Vivian returned and escorted Lynn to the airline's private lounge. In a small conference room, Tyler and Patricia were waiting, both looking like they were facing a firing squad. Tyler's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by barely concealed terror. Patricia seemed resigned, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Thank you for meeting with me, Lynn said as she took a seat across from them. I want to talk about what happened today. Tyler spoke first, his voice strained. Ms. Wong, I am so sorry. I had no idea. Lynn held up a hand to stop him. That's exactly the problem, Tyler. You had no idea who I was, so you felt it was acceptable to make assumptions about me based on my appearance. Would you have treated me differently if I'd been wearing an expensive suit? Tyler's face flushed with shame. Yes, probably, he admitted. And that, Lynn said gently, is what we need to fix. The conference room fell silent after Lynn's question. Tyler stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes, while Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Vivian stood by the door, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and professional interest. I'm not here to punish you, Lynn continued, her voice gentle but firm. I'm here to understand why this happened and how we can prevent it from happening again, to anyone. Patricia spoke up, her voice strained. Ms. Wong, I've been with Skybridge for over 10 years. I should have known better. I should have checked the system myself instead of just accepting Tyler's assessment. Yes, you should have, Lynn agreed. But I'm more interested in why neither of you thought to question your assumptions. Our company handbook explicitly states that all passengers deserve equal respect regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Tyler finally looked up. It wasn't just about your clothes, ma'am, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. When I saw your last name on the ID and the first-class ticket, I assumed you might have gotten an upgrade through connections or something. That maybe you weren't supposed to be there. Lynn nodded, understanding dawning. Because Wong is a common surname and you didn't connect it to me. I feel terrible, Tyler said, his voice cracking slightly. Everything I was taught during training. I just didn't apply it. I made a snap judgment. We all have biases, Lynn said. The key is recognizing them and not letting them affect how we treat others. She turned to Vivian. How long before boarding? About 10 minutes, Vivian replied. Good. I'd like both of you to work this flight, Lynn said, turning back to Tyler and Patricia. Consider it part of your continuing education. Patricia looked shocked. You're not suspending us? Would suspending you solve the problem? Lynn asked. Or would it just make the company feel better about doing something without actually addressing the root issue? Tyler shook his head. No, ma'am. It wouldn't fix anything, Exactly, Lynn said with a smile. Instead, I want you to work this flight, knowing who I am but treating every single passenger as if they were me. Can you do that? Both nodded earnestly. And next week, Lynn continued, I'd like you both to help develop a refresher training module about unconscious bias for all our customer-facing staff. Your perspective will be valuable since you've experienced this firsthand. Patricia's eyes widened in surprise. You want us to help create training? Who better? Lynn asked. You've just had a powerful learning experience. Why not use it to help others? The tension in the room had transformed into something else, a sense of purpose and redemption. Tyler, who had entered the room expecting to lose his job, now looked determined to prove himself worthy of this second chance. Thank you, Ms. Wong, he said sincerely. I won't let you down. It's not about letting me down, Lynn replied. It's about upholding the values of the company you represent. She stood. Now I believe we have a flight to board. As they left the lounge and returned to the gate area, Lynn could feel the curious stares of passengers and staff alike. Word had spread quickly, and everyone seemed to be watching the drama unfold. Captain Chen approached as they reached the gate. We're ready for boarding, Ms. Wong, he said, then noticed Tyler and Patricia trailing behind her. His expression turned questioning. Tyler and Patricia will be handling the boarding process as planned, Lynn told him with a reassuring smile. The captain nodded, understanding that Lynn had handled the situation in her own way. Very well. We'll be departing on schedule. The boarding announcement came over the PA system, with Tyler's voice now carrying a note of renewed professionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding Skybridge Airlines Flight 372 to San Francisco. We'll start with our passengers requiring special assistance, followed by our first-class passengers. Lynn waited with the other first-class passengers, observing as Tyler and Patricia processed each boarding pass with careful attention and respect. When it was her turn, Tyler met her eyes directly. Welcome aboard, Ms. Wong. Thank you for flying with Skybridge today. You're in Seat 2A and we're honored to have you with us. The words were standard, but the sincerity behind them was new. Lynn nodded appreciatively and proceeded down the jet bridge. On board, the cabin crew had clearly been informed of her presence. They were professional but not overly deferential, exactly the balance Lynn had always tried to encourage. She settled into her first-class seat, placing her backpack under the seat in front of her rather than using the overhead bin. The flight attendant serving the first-class cabin, a man named Roy who had been with the airline for about 5 years, approached with a pre-departure beverage tray. Welcome aboard, Ms. Wong, he said quietly. May I offer you something to drink before takeoff? Water would be lovely, thank you, Lynn replied. As Roy handed her the water, he hesitated. Ma'am, I just wanted to say, we all respect how you handle these situations. The staff talks about it. How you fly incognito to check on things, Lynn smiled. Do they? I thought I was being quite sneaky. Roy laughed softly. The long-timers know to look out for you. The newer ones learn pretty quickly after their first encounter. And yet I still find things that need fixing, Lynn said, more to herself than to Roy. That's why the company keeps getting better, he replied before moving on to the next passenger. The boarding process continued smoothly, with Tyler and Patricia visible at times, checking on passengers as they settled in. Lynn noticed they were taking extra care with everyone. The elderly, parents with young children, business travelers, giving each person their full attention and respect. Once everyone was seated and the doors were closed, Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard. He made no special mention of Lynn's presence, which she appreciated. This flight needed to be as normal as possible now that the teaching moment had passed. As the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, Lynn gazed out the window at the airport operations. 23 years ago, when she'd started Skybridge with just 2 small planes, she could never have imagined how large it would become. The company now employed over 15,000 people and served millions of passengers annually. With growth had come challenges, of course. Maintaining a consistent culture across such a large organization was nearly impossible. There would always be employees like Tyler who slipped through the cracks of training, who brought their personal biases to work despite the company's best efforts. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the air. Lynn felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness that she still loved after all these years of flying. As the plane climbed through the clouds, she pulled out her tablet and opened a new document. While the incident was still fresh in her mind, she began typing notes for a company-wide initiative. The problem wasn't just with Tyler or Patricia. It was systemic. If they had felt comfortable making judgments about who belonged in first class based on appearance, others were surely doing the same. The question was how to address it effectively across the entire organization. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Lynn had outlined a 3-part plan: enhanced training on unconscious bias, mystery shopper programs with diverse participants to test staff responses, and a revised incentive system that rewarded consistent service regardless of a passenger's appearance or status. A soft chime indicated that the seatbelt sign had been turned off. Moments later, the flight attendant appeared at Lynn's side. "Ms. Wong, Captain Chen would like to invite you to visit the cockpit when you have a moment." Lynn nodded. "I'd be happy to." She saved her notes and put away her tablet. As she walked toward the front of the plane, she noticed passengers watching her with curious expressions. The story had clearly spread throughout the cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Chen welcomed her warmly. "Ms. Wong, thank you for joining us. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened at the gate." "There's no need," Lynn assured him. "It was a valuable learning experience for everyone involved, including me." "Still," the captain said, "it concerns me that our staff would make such judgments about any passenger." "That's exactly what I've been thinking about," Lynn replied. "I'm drafting some new initiatives to address it more systematically." They chatted briefly about the flight and the new routes Skybridge was planning to add in the coming year. As Lynn turned to leave, Captain Chen said, "You know, Ms. Wong, many CEOs would have fired those two on the spot, maybe even made a show of it." Lynn shook her head. Firing them wouldn't solve the underlying problem. And everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes, and that's how we grow, both as individuals and as a company. As she returned to her seat, Lynn noticed Tyler moving through the cabin, assisting a passenger with stowing a bag. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a nod of profound respect. In that moment, Lynn felt confident that her approach had been the right one. The rest of the flight proceeded smoothly. The service was impeccable, not just for Lynn but for everyone she could observe. When they began their descent into San Francisco, Lynn looked out at the iconic Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance and felt satisfied with how the day had unfolded. What had begun as a routine mystery passenger flight had turned into something much more significant, a chance to directly address one of the subtle but important issues affecting the customer experience. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Lynn knew that tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, but for now, she could take pride in how this particular situation had been resolved. The San Francisco airport buzzed with activity as Lynn made her way from the gate to the baggage claim area. Several passengers from her flight kept glancing her way, whispering to their companions. The story of what had happened at the departure gate had clearly been a topic of in-flight conversation. An airport employee driving a courtesy cart spotted Lynn and immediately pulled over. "Ms. Wong, would you like a ride to the terminal exit?" Lynn smiled and shook her head. "No, thank you. I prefer to walk." The employee nodded respectfully and continued on his way. Lynn appreciated the offer, but walking through the airport gave her a chance to observe operations from a customer's perspective, always valuable for her continuous improvement mindset. As she rode the escalator down to the baggage claim area, Lynn's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was May, her assistant. "Hello, May," Lynn answered. "Lynn, I just got a call from Vivian at the departure airport. She told me what happened. Are you okay?" Lynn chuckled. "I'm fine. It was actually quite enlightening." "She said you didn't fire anyone," May said, a note of surprise in her voice. "Why would I? They made a mistake, they learned from it, and now they're going to help others learn too." May sighed. "You're too nice sometimes." If you'd been there, they would have recognized me immediately," Lynn pointed out. "You would have been calling ahead to make sure everything was perfect. That's your job and you do it wonderfully. But then I wouldn't have discovered this gap in our service approach." There was a pause before May spoke again. "I suppose you're right. Still, to think they bumped the owner of the airline from first class because of how she was dressed?" "Exactly. And if they did it to me, they've probably done it to others." That's the real problem we need to fix. After retrieving her bag, Lynn headed for the exit where a company car was waiting to take her to her hotel. The driver, unaware of what had transpired earlier, treated her with the same professional courtesy he would show any executive. Lynn made a mental note of this. Consistency of service was what they needed across the board. At her hotel, Lynn declined the staff's offer to help with her single bag and made her way to her room. Once settled, she opened her laptop and began expanding on the notes she'd made during the flight. What had started as a simple list had evolved into a comprehensive proposal for company-wide change. By midnight, Lynn had completed the first draft of what she was calling the Consistent Respect Initiative. She sent it to May with instructions to schedule a leadership team meeting for the day after her return. Finally, she allowed herself to rest, though her mind continued to process the day's events even as she drifted off to sleep. 6 months later, Lynn stood in line at the check-in counter of a different airport. Once again dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. To most observers, she looked like any other middle-aged woman preparing for a flight, not the CEO of one of the country's largest airlines. This time, Lynn was testing the results of the changes she'd implemented following the incident 6 months ago. The Consistent Respect Initiative had rolled out across all Skybridge locations, starting with comprehensive training developed in part by Tyler and Patricia. Both had thrown themselves into the project with remarkable dedication, turning their mistake into a powerful teaching tool. Lynn stepped up to the counter and handed her ID and first-class ticket to the agent, a young woman named Grace, who had been hired just 3 months ago, according to the small trainee badge on her uniform. "Good morning, Ms. Wang Chen," Grace said, examining the documents. "You're in first class today. Seat the very first row, the window." "Is that acceptable?" "Yes, that's perfect," Lynn replied, watching for any sign of hesitation or judgment. Grace processed the boarding pass efficiently, her manner professional and warm. "Have you flown with Skybridge before?" she asked as she worked. "Many times," Lynn said with a smile. "Wonderful. We appreciate your loyalty." Grace handed back the boarding pass and ID. "Our first-class lounge is located just past security to your right, if you'd like to wait there before boarding. Your flight is on time and will begin boarding in approximately 45 minutes. "Thank you, Grace," Lynn said, noting with satisfaction that the young woman had treated her with the same respect she would give any first-class passenger, regardless of appearance. As Lynn moved through security and toward the gate, she noticed other subtle changes throughout the airport. The Skybridge staff, she observed, seemed more attentive to all passengers, helping an elderly man navigate the security line, assisting a harried mother with her stroller, patiently answering questions from a confused first-time flyer. These changes hadn't happened overnight. The Consistent Respect Initiative had required significant investment in training, monitoring, and culture building. Lynn had personally overseen much of the process, making it clear to everyone that this was a top priority for the company. At the first-class lounge, Lynn presented her boarding pass and was welcomed inside without a second glance at her casual attire. She found a quiet corner seat and pulled out her tablet to check on some work before the flight. A few minutes later, she noticed Tyler entering the lounge. He had been promoted to training supervisor following his work on the initiative, and now spent his time traveling between Skybridge locations, helping to implement the new standards. He hadn't seen Lynn yet, and she watched as he interacted with the lounge staff. His manner confident but humble. Lynn smiled to herself, remembering his terrified expression in that conference room 6 months ago. The transformation was remarkable. When Tyler finally spotted her, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ms. Wang," he said, approaching her seat. "What a wonderful coincidence. Are you doing another mystery passenger trip?" "I am," Lynn confirmed, "though I seem to be less mysterious these days." "You recognize me immediately," Tyler laughed. "I don't think I'll ever forget you. That day changed my entire career. My whole perspective, really." "How is the training going at the smaller airports?" Lynn asked. "Challenging but rewarding," Tyler replied. "The staff are receptive once they understand why these changes matter." "Patricia has been amazing too. She's currently in our West Coast hub, running workshops on identifying and addressing unconscious bias." Lynn nodded, pleased. "And have you noticed actual changes in behavior?" Absolutely, Tyler said without hesitation. Our customer satisfaction scores are up 12% overall, and complaints about inconsistent service have dropped by nearly 20%. But the most significant change has been in staff morale. People feel proud of the way we treat passengers now. All passengers, not just the ones in expensive suits. This aligned with the data Lynn had been seeing in the monthly reports. The initiative had required significant resources, but the return on investment was already becoming evident in both tangible and intangible ways. The lounge attendant approached. "Mr. Tyler, Ms. Wong, your flight to Chicago is beginning pre-boarding now." They gathered their belongings and headed to the gate. As they walked, Tyler said quietly, "You know, many of us were surprised when you didn't fire me and Patricia that day." "Were you?" Lynn asked. "Firing you would have been easy, but it wouldn't have fixed the underlying problem, and it certainly wouldn't have given us this initiative, which has benefited the entire company. Still, not every CEO would have seen it that way." "Perhaps not," Lynn agreed, "but I've always believed that how we handle mistakes says more about our character than how we handle success." At the gate, Lynn watched as the boarding process unfolded smoothly and respectfully. The gate agents made eye contact with each passenger, smiled genuinely, and spoke clearly. There was no rush, no impatience, no subtle judgment of who belonged in which class. On board, Lynn settled into her first-class seat and declined the flight attendant's offer of a pre-departure beverage. As other passengers filed past on their way to the economy section, she noticed the flight crew treated everyone with the same attentive courtesy. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. As they taxied toward the runway, Lynn gazed out the window at the sprawling airport operations. The ground crew directing aircraft, the baggage handlers loading luggage, the fueling trucks moving between planes. Every person played an essential role in the complex dance that was modern air travel. 23 years ago, when she'd started with just 2 planes and a handful of employees, Lynn had dreamed of building an airline where everyone felt valued, both staff and passengers. There had been countless challenges along the way, many moments when that dream seemed impossible. Yet here they were, still growing, still improving, still learning from their mistakes. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. Lynn felt the familiar thrill of takeoff that had never diminished despite hundreds of flights. As the plane banked and turned toward Chicago, she smiled to herself, satisfied with how far they'd come but already thinking about the next improvement, the next challenge, the next opportunity to make her airline even better. The journey, after all, was never truly complete. Li Wei adjusted her simple cotton jacket as she walked through the busy airport terminal. Despite being worth over $2 billion, she preferred clothes that were practical rather than expensive. Today she wore plain dark blue jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a light blue button-up shirt that had been on sale at a department store. Nothing about her appearance suggested she owned the very airline she was about to fly on. As the founder and CEO of SkyRoute Airways, now the 5th largest airline in Asia, Li Wei had built her company from nothing into an aviation giant. But unlike many successful business people, fame and recognition had never interested her. In fact, she actively avoided them. Her employees often joked that she was the invisible boss because so few people knew what she looked like. She rarely appeared in press photos and declined most interview requests, preferring to let her company's service speak for itself. Li Wei pulled her small carry-on suitcase behind her, refusing the special treatment that someone of her status could easily demand. She had grown up in a small fishing village where her parents had taught her that true character showed in how you treated others, not in how others treated you. Those humble beginnings had shaped her entire approach to business and life. The bustling Singapore airport was especially crowded today. Li Wei checked her watch, still 2 hours before her flight to Bangkok. She had intentionally arrived early. These mystery shopping trips, as she called them, were her way of experiencing her airline exactly as regular customers did. No special treatment, no advance notice to staff, no executive privileges. "Excuse me," said a hurried businessman as he rushed past, nearly knocking her shoulder. Li Wei simply smiled and stepped aside. Patience was something she had in abundance. She approached a SkyRoute check-in counter where a young employee named Tanya was helping passengers. Li Wei noticed how Tanya maintained eye contact and smiled genuinely at each person. Good customer service always made Li Wei proud. "Hello. How may I help you today?" Tanya asked when it was Li Wei's turn. "I'd like to check in for the Bangkok flight, please," Li Wei said, handing over her passport. Tanya typed on her computer, then looked up with slightly widened eyes. Li Wei knew why. The system had just shown that this ordinary-looking woman had a first-class ticket. But to Tanya's credit, her professionalism never wavered. "Of course, Ms. Wong, you're all set for first class. Would you like to use our premium lounge before your flight?" "Yes, thank you," Li Wei replied. She usually checked all the services her airline offered, from economy seats to premium lounges. As she walked toward security, Li Wei thought about how far she'd come. 25 years ago, she had been working as a flight attendant, watching how airlines were run from the inside. She had noticed so many things that could be improved: the uncomfortable seats, the poor timing of meal services, the treatment of staff. Back then, she had started keeping a small notebook of ideas, never imagining that one day she would implement them in her own company. The security line moved slowly. Li Wei observed a family with small children struggling to manage their bags while keeping their kids in line. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "May I help you?" she asked the frazzled mother who was trying to fold a stroller while holding a crying baby. "Oh, that's very kind," the woman said with relief as Li Wei took the stroller and collapsed it with practiced ease. Li Wei had designed SkyRoute's family-friendly policies after watching similar scenes play out hundreds of times. After helping the family, Li Wei proceeded through security. No one gave her a second glance. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or flashing expensive jewelry. Her watch was reliable but not flashy, and her small suitcase had been through many trips. She blended in completely with the average travelers, exactly as she preferred. The premium lounge was quieter than the main terminal. Li Wei found a corner seat and pulled out her tablet. While most people assumed she was checking email or reading the news, she was actually reviewing customer feedback from the past week. Every Friday, she personally read through a random selection of comments from passengers. It kept her connected to what really mattered: the experience of the people who chose to fly with SkyRoute. One comment caught her attention. "The flight attendant noticed I was cold without me saying anything and brought me a blanket. Small gesture, huge impact." Li Wei smiled. This was exactly the kind of thoughtful service she had built her company on. She made a note to mention this in the next staff newsletter. A voice announced boarding would begin for her flight in 30 minutes. Li Wei packed up her tablet and headed to the restroom. As she washed her hands, she glanced in the mirror. At 53, her face showed signs of the hard work and long hours she had put into building SkyRoute. The few strands of gray in her black hair were earned through countless sleepless nights solving crisis after crisis in the early days. She remembered how, 15 years ago, when she was struggling to get her first 2 planes off the ground, an investor had told her that a woman couldn't successfully run an airline in Asia. That investor had later begged to buy shares when SkyRoute became profitable, but Li Wei had politely declined. She didn't hold grudges, but she never forgot lessons. Walking toward the gate, Li Wei passed a SkyRoute advertisement showing a smiling family being served by attentive flight attendants. The tagline read, "We fly like family." She had come up with that slogan herself based on her belief that every passenger should be treated like a welcome guest in your home. Her management team had originally pushed for something more corporate, but Li Wei had insisted. Personal connections mattered. The gate area was beginning to fill with passengers. Li Wei sat down next to an elderly man who was struggling to read his boarding pass. "Bangkok?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Yes," he replied, "going to see my new grandchild." "First time?" "Congratulations," Li Wei said warmly. "That's wonderful news." "Thank you," the man said, showing her a photo on his phone. "My daughter moved there for work." The flight was expensive, but worth every penny. Li Wei nodded sympathetically, making a mental note to review their senior discount program. These were the moments that informed her business decisions. Real conversations with real people. As boarding time approached, Li Wei observed the gate staff setting up. This was one of the main reasons for today's trip. She had recently implemented new boarding procedures to reduce wait times, and she wanted to see firsthand if they were working as planned. The gate staff began organizing the boarding area, setting up signs for different groups. Li Wei watched closely as they called for passengers needing special assistance first, followed by those traveling with young children. So far, everything was running according to the new protocol. A young gate agent named Dev began checking boarding passes. Li Wei noticed how he greeted each passenger with genuine warmth rather than mechanical politeness. She made a mental note to commend his supervisor later. This was exactly the kind of employee Skyroute needed. Li Wei waited until her boarding group was called before approaching the gate. She purposely never pulled rank or asked for special treatment during these mystery trips. The whole point was to experience things exactly as regular passengers did. When it was her turn, she handed her boarding pass to Dev. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Wong," he said with a smile, not recognizing the woman whose signature was on his paycheck. As Li Wei walked down the jetway, she felt the familiar mix of pride and responsibility that came with each of these trips. Every detail of the passenger experience mattered to her, from the cleanliness of the cabin to the tone of voice used by staff. In a few hours, she would be taking notes on everything, from the boarding process to the taste of the in-flight meals. This attention to detail was why Skyroute had grown from a small, regional carrier with 2 leased planes into an international airline with a fleet of 67 aircraft. Li Wei never took this success for granted. She knew that in the airline industry, reputation could change with a single bad experience. Approaching the aircraft door, Li Wei took a deep breath and prepared to begin her evaluation. The lead flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile, having no idea that the woman in the simple clothes and minimal makeup was about to notice everything about their service. The good, the bad, and everything in between. For today, Li Wei Wong wasn't a powerful CEO. She was just another passenger with a first-class ticket, about to experience the airline she had built from nothing, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Li Wei finished her cup of jasmine tea in the premium lounge, checking the time on her simple watch. Her flight would begin boarding soon. She gathered her few belongings, a small notebook where she jotted observations about Skyroute's service, her tablet, and her phone. Everything fit neatly into her modest carry-on bag, which she'd been using for years despite her wealth. It wasn't about saving money. Li Wei simply saw no reason to replace something that worked perfectly well. The lounge attendant bowed slightly as Li Wei left. "Have a pleasant flight, Ms. Wong." Li Wei smiled in return. The lounge had been comfortable but not extravagant, exactly as she'd designed it to be. Skyroute's philosophy wasn't about flashy luxury, but thoughtful comfort. Small touches made the difference. Outlets at every seat, truly quiet areas for working passengers,